So that's all I have. Now, I'll introduce our speakers. Our speakers tonight are Brenda and Michelle Spencer. Brenda Spencer has been a historic preservation professional for over 35 years, providing preservation, planning, consulting, and design services across Kansas and surrounding states. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in architecture from K-State University, and since 1994 she has had her own consulting firm outside of Wamego that has assisted more than 220 historic rehabilitation projects and listed over 100 buildings and districts on state and/or national registers. The nomination of the Sunflower Village to the National Register of Historic Places, in fact, was the first project that Brenda and Michelle together worked on professionally, and the rest is history. Michelle has been a valuable asset to the team, providing extensive research, insight, and writing to all the firm's history projects. Michelle Spencer lives in Millbrook, Alabama. She is a historian and professional genealogist with a bachelor's degree in political science and German from the University of Missouri, a master's degree in strategic studies from Missouri State, and more than 25 years of experience in research and writing. Michelle's genealogy clients have included television shows, Who Do You Think You Are, and Finding Your Roots. You can follow her blog detailing her genealogical adventures at romanmarygrace.com. Together, Brenda and Michelle have done a variety of nominations, including the first house in Topeka's historic Westboro neighborhood to be listed on the National Register, numerous commercial buildings, a brewery, manufacturing plant, barns, cemeteries, monuments, a cave, and even a modest wartime housing development. We have a donation jar at the front here tonight. I ask that you consider putting something in there, and we'll give all of the contents of that jar to Brenda and Michelle for their services tonight. They've come from very far away to come here and present with us, so I'm very grateful they were able to do that. Michelle will start off the evening sharing some history of Sunflower Village. Please welcome Michelle Spencer.
That sounded like quite a mouthful, didn't it? What I want to do first is ask something of each of you. First of all, if you can't hear me at any time, just do this, and I'll speak up a little louder. We'd rather not use a microphone. We'd rather just talk to you if we can do that, so we're going to stick with that unless you have some problems. But I'd like to ask everybody who lived in Sunflower Village to raise their hand. How about if you're married to somebody who lived in Sunflower Village? How about if you worked at the plant? Great. We are really honored by the opportunity to speak to you this evening about a project that we really enjoyed working on, and we've both kept up on the news about Sunflower Village since that time, because it's just been really interesting and exciting. We hope we can show you a few things you haven't seen, but we know you know a lot about Sunflower Village and the plant. And quite frankly, you probably know more than we do. So what we're going to try to do is to show you a few things that we think made Sunflower Village unique. We're not going to talk the history from beginning to end because we'd be here all night and a little bit of tomorrow probably too. So first of all, I'd also like to say I want to thank not only the Eudora Community Historical Society, but also the museum.
You may have to use the mic with the motorcycle.
Oh, gotcha.
Or at least
What do you think?
I have a hard time hearing you stuff.
There's a big bunch of them coming.
Right, I saw that.
No, that's the Amber Alert.
Or just yell.
Amber Alert.
Yeah, that.
It's messing up my...
You can't override surprises.
All right, it's still streaming.
You good?
Yeah, we're
okay,
good.
I turned on the mic. Does that help? Is that a little better? How about this?
Did you turn it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you just test?
Test, test. That's better. Okay. Then I'll hold this. We do want to thank both the museum here in Eudora as well as in Johnson County, who provided most of the historical photos that we've used. The modern photos were taken by Brenda and the historical newspapers I got online. And I guess we'll get Amber one more time. But what makes Sunflower Village unique? It wasn't the only wartime housing that was built. It wasn't next to the only ordnance works plant, even in Kansas. There were 42, approximately, ordnance plants across the United States. And you probably recognize a few of the names, because there was Jayhawk Ordnance Works near Parsons, Kansas. There was, that one was near Baxter Springs. Kansas Ordnance Works was near Parsons. And you also had a lot of temporary war housing, which is what Sunflower was originally conceived as, a temporary place for its workers to live. Well, was Sunflower unique? We believe it was, and we're going to show you, hopefully tonight, a few reasons, and we hope that you'll agree with us. One thing that we saw again and again when we looked at newspaper ads, when we looked at the different information, was a strong feeling of pride, not only for those who actually worked in the plant, but also those in the community around it. And you'll see several different advertisements through the slides tonight where you'll see some of that. Now, I can't explain all the events that occurred up to the time that the plant was built, but I want to remind you of just a couple of things because it puts in perspective what it meant for this Sunflower Village to be built. Of course, the United States and Kansas specifically dealt with the Dust Bowl in the 30s and leading into the Depression. But one of the things that you may not be as aware of is that we had a housing shortage across the United States really beginning after World War I. So we were already starting off in a bad situation. Then with the Depression, obviously it made it worse because with so many people out of work, they lost their homes, they lost their farms, they lost everything. And by 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was president, was talking to a group of US governors, and he said that at least 1/3 of US citizens were what he considered ill-housed. In other words, not living with 4 walls and a roof. The second phase of FDR's New Deal dealt with housing and industry. So it really puts Sunflower together because it deals with both of those aspects. Now, the president understood, however, that private industry was vital. Because in order for the United States to go to war and to really be able to compete effectively in the European theater, he didn't want the government to run everything. And that is precisely why most of the ordnance works, actually all the ordnance works were run by private companies, by private industry. And obviously, I'm sure you know it was Hercules Powder Company. As the war clouds darkened over Europe, over 200 potential sites across the United States were surveyed by the Navy and more by the Army. The funny thing is that the place in which Sunflower Village and the factory ended up was surveyed by the Navy. But as you know, it was the Army that chose them. In the 1930s, there were 4 powder plants in the United States, 4. After the 1940s, the United States added 3 more after 1940. But after December 7th, 1941, Congress funded 25 additional plants. And as I'm sure you know, on February 26, 1942, the U.S. Army decided to build Sunflower Ordnance Works. Now, when the news was announced, locals realized that they would have to sacrifice a lot. Over 10,000 acres were used by the plant. And that meant, of course, farmers and local citizens had to relocate or had to lose some of the things that they owned themselves. But there was very little pushback on that. The farmers, the local residents said, our boys are already fighting, and we're prepared to make that sacrifice as well. In fact, one citizen said it was the least we could do. However, the mayor of Eudora at the time, well, he was a little concerned because he was thinking long term. He said, I'm not sure if this is a good thing for our area. And it wasn't that he was unpatriotic or he was against it, but again, it was part of his job to think long term and think about what it would mean if the plant closed immediately after the war, after so many people had come. He might also have been thinking that there was no hotel, no boarding house, and the estimate is about 7 empty houses in Eudora at the time. So he knew it was going to be a challenge. Within only a few weeks of the announcement, so not the initial construction, from the announcement that they were going to build, people started heading your way. From Arkansas, Oklahoma, all over Kansas and Missouri. Initially, it was announced that the plant assumed they would hire between 4,000 to 6,000 people. And thus, they expected them to be able to live in the communities that were in existence, primarily Lawrence and Kansas City. They had bus routes, they had trains, but obviously all of that was going to need to be connected, and all of that was going to really have to require a conductor or a committee of conductors. Now, as you can imagine, life in the communities in which you live were dramatically altered almost overnight. Within 3 months, Eudora's population doubled to 1,800. DeSoto's, by 1943, had gone from 400 to over 1,000. And as you also probably know, at least 150 trailers, if not more, were parked in every available space. And there are 2 anecdotes which, again, you've probably heard, but I thought were very telling. And one of them was, there was even a report in the newspaper asking people not to go for walks at night. Not because it was a crime-ridden area or there was any concern, other than you might step on someone who was sleeping on the ground. The other is a story about a cafe owner who was so busy and so overwhelmed, he took his keys off the hook, he went out in the street, throwed them in the lot, and said, I'll pick them back up when I need them, and clearly that won't be till after the war has ended. Now, they came by bus, rail, carpool, a little bit of everything. Initially, they planned for the staff of both Hercules and the Army to be in Lawrence, so they set up temporary offices there, but very quickly they realized that would not work, and they would need to be on site. So they set up a small trailer camp with about 400 units where they could both work and live. They also added a grocery store and a school. Now this was very temporary. Again, we're talking trailers, but they just needed to get going and for people to be there around the clock. Recruitment for the plant touted ideal working conditions. And if you can read this, it says you need to share a ride, for one thing, because carpooling became a requirement, and they began to check people at the gate to make sure that the minimum number of passengers were in the car. Hercules also offered personal car insurance to cover the drivers of the vehicles. But they still had two primary challenges, and of course that was transportation and housing. The buses ran continuously, and as I'm sure you know, so did the traffic. The vehicle traffic on Highway 10, and we came in on Kansas, the old Highway 10, just to kind of get a feel of how many employees came to work. The shift changed 3 times a day, and the traffic could be backed up for as much as 2 hours with each shift change. They had traffic patrolmen standing in or blocking off alleyways in DeSoto to keep people from trying to take the back way, which is exactly what I would have done. Obviously, very soon they realized they would need to build some housing. So they started in May 1943 with segregated dormitories, meaning men on one side and women in a different building. And they did have some family units, approximately for 350 employees. As you can imagine, that didn't really go very far. It didn't really make a dent into the traffic, into the congestion. And again, they are trying to get people to come and work here. They need to keep them, they need to get them employed, and they need to train them. By late 1942, the government announced the construction of Sunflower Village. And they added that the housing units would not lessen the fact that thousands would still need to come from other communities. But the initial Sunflower Village was built of 852 housing units, and it opened in August of 1943. Well, it was full to capacity in less than a year. And there was a waiting list of over 1,000 families. These pictures are probably familiar to some of you, or at least the concept behind them. Now, the buses that came also stopped in Eudora and DeSoto. That worked 2 ways. Basically, it helped the local businesses there, cafes, banks, and other service industries flourished because of Sunflower Village and of the plant. But also, it meant that some employees could work or live in the surrounding communities. Now, Sunflower Village was a government-owned housing, but there are some things that make it unique. And here I wanted to just show you a few of the pictures and a few of the ways in which the village acted as part of a recruiting for plant employees. And I loved that one, that you're out in the country where there's abundance of fresh, clean air, and you're not all bunched up in one building, but you're spread out over a significant amount of space in different buildings. And of course, the other one, these are from newspapers. So again, these are the ways that they were trying to get people to come and to join. You can imagine how difficult the training was. Only 10% of employees had ever worked in any type of manufacturing, and probably none of them had worked in any type of ordnance works. So continually training and reminding people of the dangers had to be a daily chore for a good percentage of the training staff. Now, by December of 1944, Thomas Williamson, who was the head of the Manpower Commission of Kansas, was concerned still because they were dealing with not having enough employees to keep up with the demand for powder. And he said, at this moment, we are winning the war in Europe and in Asia and losing it at home. So the village played a huge role in recruiting. Here is a place to live with amenities such as schools, daycare, a church, doctors, pharmacy, groceries. all of those were vital to recruit and maintain employees. And you can imagine, even if someone lives somewhere else in one of the surrounding communities, they may still have taken part and used some of the facilities right there in Sunflower Village. Now, you are also, I'm sure, aware that Sunflower Village was a vital aspect. The plant and the village both were a vital aspect, and patriotism was extremely important. This also was borne out when you see advertisements in the newspaper. And here I wanted to just show you one personal link that we have in our own family. This is our first cousin twice removed. That means this man, his name is Thomas Bailey Hill. He was our grandmother's first cousin. And Thomas married Miss Berthina in 1944. Well, after they got married, and they lived in Laclede County, Missouri, which is sort of in central Missouri, and after they got married, they realized that they wanted to play their part, to do their part in the war. By the way, Bailey was too young to be drafted at that time. So when he got married, he was about 19. He decided to come work at the Sunflower Ordnance Works plant. And I wondered, how did he find out about this? And I talked to him after we had done the National Register nomination. I said, Bailey, how did you even know? He said, well, everybody knew. But one of the links I found in the newspaper is, even though he lived in central Missouri, I asked him what newspaper he and his family read. And he said, we got the weekly Kansas City Star. Yeah. And this ad was from about that time, in the middle of 1944, in the weekly Kansas City Star. And again, it was a call to patriotism. It was a call for people to come and work at Sunflower Ordnance Works. And both Bailey and Berthina worked at the plant. They lived in Eudora. They didn't live in the village. But he said he absolutely remembered Walgreens and going to the soda counter there sometimes after they got off work. So what was life like in the village? As you probably know, there was a commercial center, because in addition to the housing units, Hercules and the government clearly understood that people would have to have those amenities we've already discussed. But in addition to shops, schools, and churches, they also had a community center and management offices that allowed a much smoother running of the village. In one newspaper, this was also in the Kansas City Star, said in 1944, quote, "The commercial block is becoming like most downtown shopping districts of any medium-sized city. The big Walgreens drugstore on the corner is a popular spot to shop and to stop in for a soda or even a meal. The beauty shop is so popular that a stranger might have to wait 3 weeks, even for an appointment. The barber shop offers haircuts, shaves, and shoe shine. The post office is open for a few hours, and it was staffed by volunteer women in the village. Doctors and dentists have offices in the village as well," unquote. That just gives you an idea that not only did they exist, but they were important enough to the broader Kansas and Missouri community that they reported on them in the newspaper. That's looking familiar, isn't it? Now, residents at Sunflower Village had several options for food. I just mentioned the drugstore, that was one option. They had the food service counter. But given the fact that in many households, both parents worked different shifts at the plant, there were daily deliveries of milk, bread, pastries, and ice, in addition to mail and newspapers throughout the war. While some Sunflower Village citizens planted small gardens, they quickly realized that that was a pretty good idea. So they set aside a large acreage for a large communal victory garden. And this helped to sustain the families and the village through the war. Now there were two aspects of the village, and you might see this one. The lower is obviously a picture of one of the classes at the elementary school. But two of the features that we found so interesting were the fact that there was a village town council and there was a newspaper. Not just at the plant, but also the village itself. And that is unusual for a government-run entity, as you can imagine. Because while the government helped to publish, they helped to edit, they asked the villagers themselves to write. And in fact, the plant newspaper was in the inaugural issue of what was called the Sunflower Planet. George Ripley, the plant manager at that time, said, "We trust this paper will help us all get better acquainted, and it is our desire that you consider it your paper." These resources in the town council were really two significant features that made us understand the community aspect that was created at Sunflower Village. Now, after the war, I missed one of my slides. As the war ended, in fact, the day that the Japanese surrendered, the Sunflower Sentinel had this article. I actually was able to buy this newspaper online, so I own this copy of the Sunflower Sentinel. It hangs in my guest bath, actually. But this is a message from the Commanding General of Sunflower Ordnance Works. And what I found so interesting about it, and maybe it's not surprising, but he clearly talks about how every single worker and their family members should feel a huge sense of pride in what they had accomplished. And he wasn't the only one. Surrounding communities, including Tonganoxie, is that right?
Yep.
Had ads like this in the local newspapers, explaining how proud they were of Sunflower Village. So it wasn't just those who lived here or those who worked at the plant. It was also the surrounding areas. Well, what about after the war? The Kansas City Star called it the dormitory on the Kansas prairie. As the war ended and the production declined, there were only a few hundred workers that were needed in late 1945. The Ordnance Works plant had produced 175 million pounds of powder to support the war effort. 50 million of those were between May and August 1945 alone. That's pretty incredible. On September 1st, 1945, the production slowed by half and continued to decline. However, in October 1946, the Ordnance Works began to produce ammonium nitrate. Does everybody know what that's for? Fertilizer. Why? Because people were starving in Europe. And so it was one of our largest exports at the time to help feed those in the countries in Europe who had experienced such devastation. One of the major concerns for the United States in the post-war era was the instability that was caused by famine and starvation in Europe and Asia. And so this was another vital role that the plant played. As many homes were vacated after the end of the war, many people began to wonder about the Sunflower Village. Did it have a future? Just like that mayor of Eudora had said, I don't know what's going to happen after the war's over. Where will we be then? But someone, or maybe many people, had a great idea. And that is that Sunflower Village could provide an answer in Lawrence and Kansas City areas. And that is housing for returning veterans. Now, the housing shortage, of course, was not the only problem. Franklin Delano Roosevelt realized that his administration had been thinking about what happens when all of these men come back. They will flood the job market, and we will again struggle with our economy. So they passed what we know as the GI Bill. In 1944, it was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And I'm sure you know that it provided opportunities for veterans to go to college and other types of training. Also, you probably know that home ownership prior to this time was very, very difficult. And the GI Bill helped to secure some of those loans and make it much easier to get a home of your own. What Sunflower Village did was to provide a low-cost option where veterans could live and go to school in Lawrence. And so it transitioned from a village supporting the plant to a village really supporting the entire area, but especially the college. And I loved this cartoon. I know you can't read all of the little things, but it's really, really funny because it goes through each aspect of daily life and shows how now those living in Sunflower Village are veterans and they're growing families. So a lot of it is showing little kids as those in charge now in the village. Now, as you know, Sunflower Village and the plant continued to be a vital part of national security, played a vital role in defense throughout the 60s and 70s. Starting with the war in Korea in the 50s, actually, production was ramped back up. And many plant workers lived in the village and in the communities surrounding the area. By the 1970s, however, the government had decided it's time to relinquish ownership. And a private developer by the name of Paul Hanson, who lived in Kansas City, bought Sunflower Village. And he had a dream. And his dream was to make Sunflower Village into a retirement community. He wanted to improve the image, and he renamed Sunflower Village Clearview City. He did that because he wanted people to feel and to consider, when they heard those words, what it was like to live out in that clear air on the Kansas prairie. So he began, at the time when he bought the village in 1971, there were about 1,100 residents. 625 of them were students, not at the university, but in the schools in the village. He embarked upon a comprehensive renovation program. He improved the housing the commercial and public buildings. He spent some time and some effort, including the outdoor spaces. He really worked hard. You saw these ads, you saw a lot of newspaper articles about Clearview City and the work he was doing there. He wanted a fully functioning, self-contained community with amenities for those senior citizens. He was considering it a retirement haven, and the prices were going to be $60 to $125 a month to rent the apartments. He realized senior citizens would also need medical care, and he planned to build a nursing center that would provide that care through the end of life. But he also wanted people to have he wanted them to have a full active life. So he hired an activities coordinator, and they provided a schedule of events that included fishing on the private lake, crafts and sewing, billiards, and a 5,000 book library that he provided. The retirement village included a supermarket, a post office, a restaurant, a savings and loan bank, the administration office, a laundromat, and a beauty shop. And the community center had a swimming pool. It sounds like a pretty good deal, but unfortunately, Paul Hanson died tragically when the Kansas City Hyatt Regency Skywalk collapsed in 1981. And so many of his plans never came to fruition because he died without a will. And while his children tried to figure out what his vision would look like and how he could make it go, how they could carry it on, they did not succeed. So, this gives you a rough idea of some of the reason that the village was special. Brenda's now going to talk about some of the physical aspects of the village. And that's more reasons the village was unique and provided a sense of place.
You know, I had forgotten, it was, how many years ago? 8 years ago that we wrote this. I had forgotten about the Hyatt Regency. My background's actually in architecture, and nothing, you know, any industry you're talking about, people that are educated in a certain decade are impacted by certain things. The Hyatt Regency fiasco was what my generation of architectural students were influenced by. You know, the focus really shifted from this organic design thing to safety, to working with engineers, and I had forgotten that connection. What I'd like to talk about just for a few minutes, you know, I come at this from a different point of view, looking at the architectural design of the village as a whole, as well as the individual apartments. But one thing I want you to think about, Michelle talked about what was going on in the years prior to the war, and I want you to remember that, you know, whether it was farmers, whether it was bankers, architects had no work during the Depression. You know, nobody was building. That continued during the war. Not only because of material shortages due to the war or limitations, but you know, no one in the private sector was building. So the only work architects had was working for the government. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Hair and Hair. They have a lot of work in Kansas City area. Fairly well-known landscape architects, and Hare is the firm that designed this plan, the layout of Sunflower Village. So I always thought that was a pretty cool feature of it just starting out. I have no idea if he was involved once things started, or just really designed the layout of the village itself. But the key features, it's interesting to me because it really is the planned community of the 1970s that we saw from a private sector that are the basis of this design in the 40s. And that was curvilinear roads, you know, not the grid. I mean, it is a semi-grid, but small neighborhood clusters, even though it's a very large housing complex. Alleys, well, primary roads, the ring road, and alleys that kept the vehicles from the front of houses. And this common green space, essentially a very small park-like setting between every two buildings. Now the irony is, people that I've met, so I'm curious to hear from you guys after we finish up, you guys that live there, what I have been told is, you know, that may have been the concept behind the design, but it didn't quite work because everybody played in the alleys, not in the front yards. So, you know, I can see that, us doing that as well. You know, as Michelle mentioned, I think that we're not only talking about the apartment houses themselves or this effort to physically design a community that works together as a cohesive place, but also it was the fishing lakes. It was green space for recreation, or the Victory Garden. And as you can see, this is just what 2014 map, aerial view of the village. You see it was built exactly like the Hare plan. You know, this is just a little section of it, but the loop road, curvilinear, and each of the white stripes you see, the bigger white stripes, are the alleys behind the buildings, and then the little bitty thin stripes you see are the sidewalks in the park between two houses, or two apartment buildings, at the front of the house. And you can see the alley in the upper right. You see the park-like setting in the lower right. And you see the pond that's just outside the ring road. Don't get me wrong, we're not talking about a fancy place here. And you know, you have to remember the wartime shortages and rationing that was taking place. You know, wood was next to impossible to get. And I'm not sure I totally understand, you know, what wood was used for in terms of the war effort, like it's pretty obvious when we talk about rubber. But Sunflower Village, another thing that makes it unique in my opinion, these are little concrete block boxes. They went up fast. The roofs were tar paper, no shingles, no asphalt, no petroleum products. And obviously, this is the only interior original photo that I'm aware of. You see the original kitchen. They did have wood shelves for the kitchen. There were no doors on the cabinet because that was, you know, superfluous. It was not a necessary thing. So you literally had open shelves. One of the things that I absolutely love, and you know, looking at this from an architect's point of view, people think it's kind of silly if, you know, I tell them, well, you really have to keep the chimneys. And it's not because I love chimneys or anybody's using. The fireplaces have long since been removed and replaced in most of the units. I think there are fireplaces and 2 apartments left. But if you look at that upper left photo, count the number of chimneys, that's how many units were in that building. So this is the largest one, which was 6 units. And the one on the upper right is actually missing 1 chimney. All of the buildings had little bitty units on the, is this one the point top? On the end. Oh, wait. That's okay.
You went forward.
They were essentially studio units, 1-room units on the ends, and then most were 1-bedroom units, whether there were 4 or 2 of them. The size of the homes did vary, or the buildings did vary, based on the number of apartments in each. The vast majority of the end apartments have been encompassed into apartments in the center of the buildings. There are a few exceptions, and you can see that here on the lower left. You know, that was a 2014 photo. There's a gentleman that's lived there for, I'd love to know if he's still there, that I met, still living there in 2014, and lived in this little 1-room unit in this building. So Michelle talked a little bit about Paul Hanson. He really did have a pretty incredible vision for this space. And it would have been interesting to see how that would have been accepted. But I do want to show you what they did in terms of the building renovation projects. You can see in the upper right, a detail of it on the upper left. They added faux brick or stone veneer, you know, little bitty, I mean, obviously they didn't build brick, on surrounding the front entrances in the middle of all the buildings, and they added this little intersecting gable entry porch to kind of define those front entrances. But again, what everybody's telling me that lived there was, you know, we don't use the front door anyway. So you know, it's a little bit amusing that was the primary extra alteration. They did add shutters on the windows, and a lot of the units, I don't think you can really see that in the slide, but a lot of the buildings, they put a rough textured coating on the concrete block to modernize, you know, the buildings so that they weren't just plain exposed concrete block. And you can see the kitchen upgrades that took place in most of the units. The lower right is what most of the buildings look like today, or a lot of the buildings. That's basically the renovations that the existing owner has done in the last 20 years. They have installed some wood siding over the concrete in some places and painted most of them. As Michelle mentioned, we listed this complex on the National Register of Historic Places and the Register of Kansas Historic Places in 2014. The photos you see were in 2014. It retains a lot of the same basic characteristics. You know, if you've ever, you know, looked at listing a building on the National Register, you know that it has to maintain a certain level of historic integrity. And I had a real question when I was first contacted about this, the prospect of doing this project, because the form of the buildings was changed in that 1970s modernization project with the addition of that projecting porch, new materials on it that obviously the government, you know, it doesn't reflect the wartime housing image. But, I mean, unanimously, the opinion was that the village as a whole, the design, the sense of community, the fact that it was built in 7 months, you know, it just reflects an incredible period of history that is relatively unique to Kansas. I've worked in 2 other of the wartime housing plants. There's just no comparison in terms of the sense of community. Distinctions in units, you can see, you know, the vast majority of the red are contributing resources in the village. The black are non. Vast majority are contributing historically significant. There are a few. I don't think mine.
Yeah, it did.
It did?
Uh-huh.
Don't see it. Oh well. There are a few voids. There are 7 buildings that were lost over time. Couple fires, lack of, you know, for some reason or another, a certain unit missed the improvements and just got to a point that they weren't safe to live in, and they tore a couple down. Very similar map, but the pink, or it looks pink on here, are the dwelling units, the buildings that still operate or as apartments. But the blue are storage units. And one of the big issues, as you can imagine, in these smaller apartments was we need storage. We want garages. And, you know, a few could have installed little carports in the back or on the side, but most didn't have the ability to do that. So they actually converted some of the buildings toward the rear, kind of throughout, to storage, and they would rent those for an extra fee if you wanted additional storage space. Same thing, the garage, if you wanted a place to park your vehicle. The church is in a former house, or former dwelling apartment building. And you can see here the vacated buildings, you know, windows boarded up. Some of the windows were actually removed. And then on the lower right, you see the buildings that were used as garages. And I think the thing that, and I do have permission to share, is pretty exciting to me. I have talked to the owners. Well, first of all, I should step back. David and Suzanne Rhodes, who have owned the property for years now. There was an owner, for 2 years after the Hanson estate was finally settled, but Rhodes bought it, I believe, in 79 or 81. And the amazing thing is David Rhodes is one of those people who, he was actually brought home from the hospital by his mother to Sunflower Village. His dad was a GI and was attending KU on the GI Bill. So, you know, it was a special place to him growing up, and he had the opportunity to buy it 30 years later and did so. I visited with Dave several times over the years, and he's just never quite been able to get the package together to do a complete renovation on the village. And as I'm sure most of you know, it may not have had a great reputation when some of you were living there, but now it's really not a great reputation. It's been converted to low-income housing. It's a pretty sad statement on you know, some of our living conditions today. It shook me up a little bit the first time I was there. But there's still that sense of pride. And, you know, I've probably talked to David 5 times in the last 8 years where they're still trying to put it together, make it work. And they actually partnered with Kelly Raby at Prairie Fire Development Group in Kansas City. And they are very close to getting the ball rolling on a large renovation project. And what's so exciting to me is not only are they going to improve the apartments themselves, but those buildings that are missing, they're going to rebuild. Those buildings that were converted to garages and storage units, they're going to convert back to apartments. And, you know, I'm not saying this is going to be a fancy place to live, but it's going to be, it's going to restore some major pride in people that live there. the plans I've seen are pretty nice. And obviously, if all this happens with the sunflower plant and, you know, the renovation of the village, it's going to be pretty incredible and a pretty exciting time. So, back to Michelle's question at the beginning, is Sunflower Village unique? No question about it. You know, it's in your backyard. It's an incredible story from a historic perspective. I think it's fascinating from a physical or design perspective to know that the government really did think about providing green space and a sense of community for the people that were going to be living there. And Michelle and I both agreed that's one of our favorite photos. That's obviously over at the plant, not the village. But just that group of togetherness, sense of community, I think is a really important part. Michelle and I, you know, I know it shocked Ben when he realized Michelle was from Alabama, and, you know, my parents still live in Missouri, where we grew up, and so Michelle comes to Missouri fairly frequently. I don't get her out to my house. I live outside of Manhattan, near Wamego, and so this was just a great opportunity. She said, well, I'd love to do it, so I got to spend the week with my sister, and we do a little bit of, you want to grab by the door? We do quite a bit of antiquing still, and, you know, each of us have things to collect, and Ben, I've got something for you. So, no, you gotta come up. It's deluxe. So, you know, and you've seen the ads of Hercules and Hercules powder. I hope you don't already have one, but even if you do, it's still deluxe.
Yeah. Oh,
we
yeah.
found a Hercules crane at an antique store in Abilene last weekend. So we want to donate that to the museum, just in the name of all of you that work there or live there. And it's kind of funny because Michelle actually found one and gave it to me. So when we saw that one this weekend, we were like, oh, we got to take it to Eudora. So,
Thank you.
You bet. Well, thank you, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. I know there's several of you that live in the village or worked at the plant and may have stories to share tonight or at your next presentation.
We'd love to hear them.
Yeah, we'd love to hear them too. So, I think some of you probably know more about the apartments than I do.
What was
Yeah.
this population at its peak? How big was Sunflowerville?
The village.
Offhand. I don't know
Yeah.
offhand.
I
I'm
don't.
sorry. I know it's in the nomination, but I don't have it in my brain.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, you have a drawing and it's this big expansive place, but on Google Earth today, it's only a fraction, so.
You know,
talk
the
about that?
amazing thing, I'm sitting here looking at this first slide that's up there. I have a rendering of that, not a photo. And I always thought it was proposed expansion that wasn't built. And I know it was built.
Two villages.
So they built an expansion that included the area to the east that ultimately was removed. And as I understand, some of them were wood frame,
Yep, yes.
and
They're
they literally
scattered
were
all over
falling.
the country.
I'm sorry?
They're scattered all over the
They're
country.
scattered all over the country. There's houses.
They
here in
sold it,
Eudora,
yeah, just like Camp
and
Tungsten at
DeSoto
Fort
were
Riley.
built out.
Yeah, for $500 you could buy one and they would haul it and set it on your property.
Oh, wow, that's impressive. I was working out in Wilson, Kansas years ago, and Camp Tungsten, the World War I camp at Fort Riley, was disassembled similarly, offered to soldiers who were there. They put those on the railroad cars, and the guy took it out at Wilson and built a little car dealership out of it.
So I looked it up. Less than a year after the first resident moved in, it was 1,650 people.
I wanted to say 1,700, but I wasn't sure. So obviously that was, this is Sunflower Road, this is K10, this is the original village, was the expansion, and that's what was disassembled later. Yes,
As part of the new east side, that bigger building would be a theater and a bowling alley, and you didn't bring that up. That's- I'm assuming that's gone with everything else.
yes, there's nothing left east of Sunflower Road.
I would also say that my name's David Monahan, I've lived there for 4 or 5 years.
Did you not find,
I brought some pictures, if y'all want to look at them. Some are about baseball, some are about just the village. And you look at that, it's over, and I'm going to take it back to take.
bowling alley and the restaurant,
And
and the movie theater,
Yep, movie.
that's personal interest to me. That's where, in the parking lot that's still there, is where I gave my wife to be her engagement ring.
That's good. And you were married how many years?
59.
Wow. I've got 30 coming up. I don't know if I'll make it to 59, but
Another thing about the bowling alley was one of my classmates. I went to DeSoto High School, had a DeSoto address my entire life. I'll be 87 here in a few months. I'll make it. My classmate, he worked in the bowling alley setting pins. Yes. And for a short time, Wilt Chamberlain, a basketball player that you're all familiar with, Wilt the Stilton, they call him, he was a pin setter there until somebody found out that, oh, that's a dangerous thing. If he got hit in the leg with bowling balls, it would put him out of commission. So he made him quit.
The black shirt.
In your research, you talk about 1970 being a year in which the village was sold to a private person. Did you not find anything in 1961 by an Oklahoma investor?
yes, there was something.
It's been 8 years since we did all the research. We read.
It was sold in
Yeah.
roughly 61 to a gentleman out of Oklahoma who, I was working in a restaurant the day the thing was closed in DeSoto. And he came into the restaurant and slapped me on the head with a piece of paper and said, well, I just bought myself a town.
I forgot that, but that's true because Paul Hanson bought it from me.
I looked at it.
I knew it was privatized in the 60s, but please.
Actually, there were 3 villages.
Yes.
Had Sunflower Village, the old village, we had a new village, and we had a sailor village, which is for the sailors and families that were at the Olathe Naval Air Station.
Staff village.
And then there was staff.
And the staff village. And then there was
Then we had a staff village that was west of Sunflower Village, over by Clearview, by
I think that's
Evening
where I
Star
was.
Road.
Two-story ones are.
And I personally carried papers out there for 7.5, 8 years. And we had 2 papers every day. Had the Times in the morning, Star in the evening. They were the same company, and on Kansas City Star. And on Sunday, we had a larger paper with a bunch of comics, the intellectual section. And it was a much larger paper. There was only one paper on Sunday, thank goodness. And I started school there in September of 1943. And the first schools that we had were wooden trailers that they moved in. And we had, I think there were 2 trailers. We had all 8 grades there. And then later on, when the new school was built, my mom taught school there. Kindergarten, it had morning and evening, morning and afternoon. And this one class, well, most classes were 40. One class I know was 43 pupils. And they went to school in the morning. Another class came in We went in the afternoons. And I think there were at least 18 businesses in the old village. And we even had a dry cleaner, which was also the telegraph office. I delivered telegrams for them. And I also wrote a few telegrams. That was kind of interesting. I delivered special delivery letters for the post office. I delivered ice. I don't know of anyone that had a refrigerator at that time. They had a cardboard, piece of cardboard up there that had 25, 50, 75, 100, and that's how much ice we could deliver to them. So we walk on into the house. No one had locks. No one used the locks hardly. And we put the ice in the refrigerator and go ahead. I also delivered milk on the porch step. And sometimes I'd be delivering, if they were working night shift or something like that, or whatever shift, if they were gone, next morning you'd see the milk with the cream was raised about 2.5 inches, and the little cardboard insert was laid on top of it. And yeah, it was quite a place. It was a booming place, really.
And what's your name, sir?
Bob Bartholomew, Robert Bartholomew.
Bob, when that, do you remember, was that the heating in those units, and was that cold initially?
Yes, that's what the bins were in the alley. They delivered coal into the bin.
Coal stoves for heating, and we did have a gas stove for cooking. And hot water heaters, and a small area for washing machine. And the houses in the old days, I don't know about to do with it.
Again, I don't recall the date of him, but we had when, you know, the power company, when they
Remove the coals.
and installed the
Yeah.
gas lines
Yeah.
and the power line running by.
Hensley. Hensley was the man that bought it. Inslee.
Yes.
Got it. It's in the nomination.
It's in the nomination. I don't know if any of you've seen that. Ben can share the link to that. It's available online
It's
or.
a welfare haven. There'd be women living in those apartments, and they'd be drawing welfare from 3 different states, and their husband would be living next door, working at the plant, pulling down big wages. It was not a good place.
I taught school in Minnesota School District for 24 years, and I taught with Bob's mom at Sunflower. That was the first, Sunflower West was an elementary school. That was a big structure. It's no longer there. It's demolished. But I taught 3rd grade, even though that wasn't what I was trained for, because they bend the rules wherever there's a need, you know. So even though I was trained as a secondary teacher, I taught 3rd grade, and I loved it. I said, put the shoes on, go to the bathroom by themselves. They were like little vessels to be filled up with information.
Well, in 1953, we thought that was a plush school.
I was wondering, you had the photo of the renovated kitchen. Do you have access to any information or photography for in the 40s and 50s of what they looked like before? Because I'll assure you, they didn't look like that.
Right, that's what
You had the one
the
photo.
one original kitchen photo is
With
the
no
only
cabinet
inter
doors.
photo. That was from the federal war.
Well, I know in the
It's
60s, they at least had cabinets.
That's the only inter photo we have found from the original
That was
construction.
about all, it was still all cement block.
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna say it doesn't exist, but with all those construction photos, there was one interior view, which is the kitchen.
But they didn't look like that.
Well, one of them did somewhere.
Well,
I mean, that's a government photo stamped 1940 something.
well, I just say they weren't, none of them that I lived were around.
I wonder if they had changed that much by, what did you say, in the 60s?
49.
Oh, 49. I don't know.
That's why I didn't see a whole lot in the years after it was made. It was
Yeah,
down the road.
that's the only interior photo we found from the early views. So. Yes.
Yeah, I got a question to ask some of these old timers over there. We lived in two of the staff houses. Once they moved them out, Lawrence Wilson, he owned several of them here, and we rented that, and then later we bought one. I think we've got several of them here in Eudora that we rebuilt. But how many, or do you have any pictures of the staff houses? How many were they and who lived in them? All we know is that they was beautiful homes and they was expensive homes. But I don't know where they was at or how many there were, but they're scattered all around here where, like she said, I think they bought them for $500 a piece, and they moved them for them, and people had rented them out here.
I think they were west of the plant.
Pardon?
West of the plant, and you can still see the road.
It was
where
a circle road.
Okay. Now, who lived in those? Was those
Well,
officers?
like I know Mr. Jackson lived there, and he was like the water. I think it was, and a lot of the military.
You refer to it as a staff village.
Yeah. What am I trying to say?
The wall
Okay, because the homes, like these homes out here, we lived in those too, but these were dumps. But the staff, the staff houses, they were beautiful. They was 2-story and all hardwood floors, and they were beautiful homes.
When you're going down K10, you can see the road.
But it's closed off now, right?
Where the park is.
What was talked about first was Sunflower
Doors on there, but there
East.
wasn't much difference in that.
The
right
new
there.
village, that's what was disassembled and sold for the $500. The staff village was somewhere else.
And the west end, west side. It's the
West.
first, when you're going to the work plant, it's the first village you went by. They were sitting off to the north, south. I think there was 10 of them.
Totally
And then
separate.
like maybe 4 double-story,
Yes.
two-story.
Yeah, 2-story houses, right. So the staff village was not Sunflower Village.
Right.
Totally
And you don't
separate.
have any pictures, you don't have any pictures of that from the air when it was added?
No. We were just doing Sunflower Village.
If you look up Sunflower, there's some, they're not close, but you can see them, there's some on Stafford.
My dad worked for the company that helped build the plant and Sunflower Village, and he always told me that they had to move a cemetery.
They
Did
did.
you find that in your research?
They did. They moved Lexington Cemetery.
Okay.
Yeah, what about what's the cemetery? Oh, was Lexington Cemetery?
Was that where the plant was, or where the village was?
Yes. That's where the plant was.
Okay.
They moved it into in the center of DeSoto Cemetery. The Army picked it up. I got the records. They picked it up and brought it into the center of DeSoto Cemetery. I've got all the records for that.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to thank Michelle and Brenda Spencer for coming all the way out here to do this program for us. I think it's one of the best programs we've ever had, so thank you.
We should have gotten you guys together but while we were writing it.
That's right.
Got some of this firsthand stories. We'll stick around for a little bit, but we'll let this conclude.
Thank you.
We thank you guys for coming out. Everybody stick around. I think there's some pictures and different things. Ask questions, whatever. Thank you guys for coming out. We have our program in July about the plant, so we'll look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you guys.